In 1983, there were two superpowers. Both possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. Neither knew what the other side was thinking. In the course of the year, a series of disconnected events convinced the elderly Soviet leadership that America was about to attack. And at this precise moment, NATO began an exercise that rehearsed Armageddon. It almost triggered the real thing. Now, for the first time on television, the secret crisis of this year is reconstructed, revealing just how close we came to the Third World War.
The story is really still not known. Still not known to the extent it should be.
We were ready for the Third World War, if the Americans started it.
We may have been at the brink of nuclear war and not even known it.
If we are attacked by nuclear weapons, these are the warning sounds you must recognize. When you hear the attack warning, you and your family must take cover at once.
I mean, look how many people are against the bomb. Look!
1983. Ronald Reagan was in the White House. Yuri Andropov was in the Kremlin. And nuclear war was in the air. Oblivious to the world outside, in November that year, high-ranking NATO officers descended into a nuclear vault in Belgium. They had come from across Europe and North America to take part in an annual communications exercise called Able Archer.
Able Archer was a routine command post procedural exercise. Now, the forces taking part in a command post exercise are not the whole armies and divisions and tanks. Nothing deploys except the rather unfortunate signals squadrons and signals regiments who'd go out and man wartime posts and practice sending messages to each other.
Able Archer was a war game designed to test communications. Out in the forests of West Germany, signalers would send messages according to a tightly controlled script. These messages were then picked up in the NATO command bunker and passed on to the players of the game. The story was always the same. It began with a diplomatic incident, quickly escalated into a full-scale Soviet invasion of Europe, and on the last day of the exercise, it would end in an imaginary nuclear Armageddon.
It was treated very, very seriously. It was the atmosphere, I think, as much as anything. It became quite realistic when the only thing that wasn't realistic is that at the end of your shift, you went home for 12 hours or so and then came back again.
All across the Soviet Union, listening stations were keeping a close watch on Able Archer. Though they knew this was just a war game, its timing could not have been worse. It came at the end of a year when the relations between East and West had reached an all-time low.
Perhaps this exercise, above all, seemed very provocative. It was the provocative enactment of a major event, designed to destabilize, as it were, or in some way test the military and political leadership of the Soviet Union.
Soviet suspicions of the West were deep-rooted. For 40 years they had been preparing to defend themselves against a surprise attack. By the dawn of the 1980s, they had gained a clear advantage. In addition to a massive standing army deployed in Eastern Europe, they had over 11,000 nuclear warheads. 2,000 were the SS-20 mobile ballistic missiles. Each had 45 times the power of Hiroshima.
They started deploying SS-20s at the rate of one a week, until they had hundreds of them, which was a new class of missile designed to go after our European allies. And we had nothing in Europe to match it. So it looked like the strategic nuclear balance was coming unglued.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
President Reagan was a heroic figure, but not a romantic.
Thank you.
And yet he believed that you had to have at least parity and the ability to negotiate from a position of strength. Hence the build-up in the first 4 years of his term.
3, 2, 1, mark.
To counter the perceived Soviet superiority, Reagan began spending over $1 trillion a year on defense. By 1983, there were 10,000 American nuclear warheads aimed at the Soviet Union.
Deterrence. Carrying the biggest stick, knowing how to use it, and hoping you won't have to.
The principle of nuclear deterrence, that strategy, was a strategy of desperation that was adopted in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War to avoid a Third World War that surely would have destroyed civilization as we know it.
The pride of Reagan's arms build-up was a new medium-range nuclear missile to be introduced into Europe in November 1983. It was called Pershing II, and its imminent arrival unnerved the Soviet military.
The really dangerous thing was that the flight time of these missiles was only 6 to 8 minutes, which allowed the Americans to inflict a sudden nuclear strike and decapitate the Soviet Union. That is, to destroy the leadership inside the Kremlin. Launching a counter-strike would have been almost impossible.
The stakes were enormous for both sides. And to the Soviets, it seemed that Ronald Reagan was now prepared to go even further. On the 8th of March 1983, he made his most provocative speech of the Cold War.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
This speech was designed to offend the Kremlin, and it did.
When he called the Soviet Union the evil empire, the Soviet leadership was shocked and said, we are to expect something terrible from this reckless president.
Evil empire, evil empire.
That all made the Soviets feel that something is really brewing and they have to be ready for a nuclear attack.
Evil empire, evil empire, evil empire.
In the face of growing American hostility, the Soviet Union needed a strong leader, but the new president, Yuri Andropov, was not a well man. A career spy who had never visited the West, he succeeded Brezhnev in November 1982.
I knew chairman of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, very well. In fact, I would often report to him directly. And people from the old guard looked at him with suspicion. They thought this guy he was intellectually superior. And that's what made them feel uneasy with him. Andropov wanted to look as a tough politician, not a liberal guy.
Barely months after coming to office, Andropov's kidneys began to fail, and he spent much of the time at the Kremlin hospital south of Moscow. Here, a small cabal of Politburo members would gather each week to govern the country.
The Politburo was essentially a geriatric ward at this point. The average age, I think, was around 74, 75, somewhere in the mid-70s. These were men who obviously had clung to power for a long, long time.
The only American intelligence on them came from an unusual source.
We had received considerable intelligence on their personalities and their personal relationships by intercepting the radio traffic among their limousines. It was principally of value in giving us a feel for them as human beings. I mean, what we would get is which soccer teams these guys were for. And they would gossip about each other. And they would talk about their health problems, and some of it got pretty graphic. You basically had the impression all these guys were about to die, and they in fact were.
If Reagan's arms build-up and belligerent speeches unnerved the aging Soviets, this was just the beginning. Only 2 weeks after the Evil Empire speech, Reagan announced his most expensive, technically demanding weapons project to date, the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars.
My fellow Americans, thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
In the minds of the Soviet leadership, this was a clear statement of intent. Shooting down their missiles in space would at one stroke render their vast nuclear arsenal redundant.
So we are defenseless, and all our expenses on the rockets, they are all wasted. And they will just string us up. He's anti-communist. He says it is an evil empire. He will string us up, or just destroy us in our bunkers.
Our presumption was that surely they'll understand that our deployment of SDI is not intended to threaten them, all right? And if they say it is, that's got to be disinformation, because we don't start World War IIIs, you know, or do Pearl Harbors. We're the United States. Naive, but, I mean, that's the way people thought. That's the way people still think, frankly.
The idea of a surprise attack was etched onto the mind of the Soviet leadership. They could not forget the humiliation of June 1941, when under the guise of an exercise, Hitler marched into the Soviet Union, launching Operation Barbarossa.
For the Soviet military and for millions of Russians, the tragedy of World War II, the so-called unexpected attack, was something they would never forget. That was a painful, tragic experience. It was a national disgrace for the armed forces. They would never want to have it again.
Anyone who lived through the crucible of those times, they are not going to have a benign attitude toward the Reagan administration, and are going to do everything in their power to prepare for a nuclear Operation Barbarossa, which is what haunted all of these men.
The combination of Reagan's speeches, the US military buildup, and the imminent arrival of Pershings into Europe encouraged the Soviets to track NATO's exercise Able Archer with suspicion. Yuri Andropov was determined not to be taken by surprise again. He decided to commit the vast resources of the KGB to make absolutely sure. Haunted by the prospect of a surprise nuclear attack, the ailing Soviet leader Yuri Andropov translated his worst fears into actions. While head of the KGB, he had launched Operation Ryan. This had one aim: to collect every single warning sign of an impending Western attack.
Andropov said, and I remember, at no time in post-World War II history we had such a dangerous situation close to a war as we have today. That was amazing to me. The slogan was "Не просмотри," do not miss. Don't miss that moment when the West is about to launch a war.
Across the world, agents were ordered to find the evidence. Among them was Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel stationed in London.
Gordievsky, come on here.
When it was the instruction each fortnight to write a report about the science of preparation to a sudden nuclear attack, what should we do? To write there is no science? You will get such a blow onto your head if you write such thing.
The list of signs of impending nuclear war was seemingly endless. Agents around the world were asked to keep a watch on the price of blood, stockpiles of petrol, supplies of meat, the movements of diplomatic cars.
Soviet spies were given odd tasks like going round counting how many lights were on in the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall after 9 o'clock in the evening. Those who know about these things will realise the lights were on so the cleaners could do their work, but apparently in the eyes of Soviet spies it might be an indicator of preparing for nuclear war. That, I think, illustrates both how absurd the system was, but how potentially dangerous some of the miscalculations could have been.
All of this intelligence was reported back to Moscow. Here, the future boss of the KGB, Vladimir Khrushchev, took over the running of Operation Rian.
Well, I served in the intelligence for 32 years, and I met different chiefs of intelligence. The most paranoid, most anti-Western, totally inflexible man was Vladimir Khrushchev, the last chairman of the KGB. He would never receive information which said something nice or simply objective about the West. He would never accept that. He said, this is disinformation.
Even today, aged 83, Vladimir Khrushchev remains convinced of the Americans' intentions.
Operation Rian had one aim: to give advance warning in good time. Failed to give advance warning that the missiles had flown, and it would already be too late. The problem was the Americans declared they had the right to use nuclear weapons first, and they did everything to ensure that there was that possibility.
Inside Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB, Khrushchev set up a dedicated Rian room. Here, every report was fed into a vast computer and chalked up on a board.
The analysts were putting crosses on the squares. As soon as they were receiving reports from the stations about signs of preparation. And the number of crosses was slowly growing, which was making the point, yes, they're preparing, so the concept is correct.
Once the Rian board was full, every sign of an impending nuclear attack would be in place. At that point, it would be time to press the button. By the 4th of November 1983, NATO's war game had begun to accelerate. According to the script, Soviet forces were pouring into West Germany, Norway and Greece. We now know that Vladimir Khrushchev had already sent an urgent directive to KGB agents across the world.
The threat of an outbreak of nuclear war is reaching an extremely dangerous point. A surprise nuclear attack on the USSR has acquired even greater urgency and immediacy.
What had unnerved the Soviet leadership so much to issue this warning? It wasn't just the escalation of Exercise Able Archer. It was the suspicion that 8 weeks earlier, the Americans might have just found the pretext they needed to go to war. On the night of the 31st of August 1983, Soviet air defenses in the Far East picked up an unknown aircraft heading towards a sensitive naval base.
The trespassing plane was already at southern Kamchatka, and as it came out over the Sea of Okhotsk, there appeared above it an interesting satellite. And then the plane sent a telegram to the satellite.
The Soviet military were convinced that this was a US spy plane probing their airspace. In 1983, American pilots regularly flew this kind of reconnaissance mission. They would gather as much intelligence as they dared before returning to international airspace. But this mysterious aircraft did not turn back. A pair of Soviet fighters was immediately scrambled in response. First into the air was Gennady Osipovich.
They said to me, test your weaponry. That kind of command is given rarely, and it put me on my guard. So I tested it. Everything was okay. I asked what has happened. They said a plane has violated Soviet airspace. It's coming right towards you.
In less than a minute, Osipovich had caught up with the mysterious aeroplane.
I am positioned like this. This is him flying and this is me. And I am flashing my lights. Everything is visible. I could even see the portholes illuminated. 2 rows of portholes.
As the aeroplane failed to respond, Osipovich was then ordered to fire a warning salvo across its bows.
There weren't tracer bullets. I didn't even see them. They were just normal armor-piercing shells.
At last, the aeroplane began to change course. It broke away towards international airspace.
As soon as I got this information, I reported it to Agarkov, the chief of the General Staff. He ordered me to destroy the plane immediately.
Unknown to the Soviet controllers, their conversations with Osipovich had been picked up by an American listening post in the Far East. This is what they heard.
I had no emotion. Even at that time I had no emotion. I was simply pleased that I had carried out my task.
Osipovich had not shot down a spy plane. In fact, it was Korean Airlines Flight 007 from Anchorage to Seoul. There were 269 people on board.
What can we think of a regime that so broadly trumpets its vision of peace and global disarmament, and yet so callously and quickly commits a terrorist act to sacrifice the lives of innocent human beings?
At first, the Soviet leadership refused to admit shooting the airliner down. Then when they did, they claimed it was on a spy mission and went to elaborate lengths to prove it.
Well, we altered the tape. I had said the wing lights are flashing, so now I had to say they are not flashing. They took an electric razor, turned it on, and made me say they are not flashing, using the razor to imitate the background noise in the cockpit. I did it over and over again. I didn't know you could fake this noise with a razor.
The worry was, did it reflect a lack of control of the military? That maybe some local commander on his own initiative had been able to do this without any direct instruction from Moscow. And if that had been the case, what would that tell you about the ability to use at least tactical nuclear weapons, for instance? So I remember that being a worry at the time.
And I think the Soviet leaders, in a strange sort of way, were deeply offended and hurt. Anything that questioned their legitimacy or the fact that they were civilized people really got under their skin.
It was not a humane regime, but they felt guilty. They felt affected that it happened like this. So it was a terrible crime. I was very depressed.
In the face of worldwide condemnation, KGB stations were warned that the shoot-down was being exploited by America to whip up anti-Soviet hysteria. It was against this backdrop that Exercise Able Archer was gathering pace. Deep inside the NATO nuclear bunker in Belgium, the war game continued according to the script. Though it was only testing communications, the Soviets tracked Able Archer with increasing alarm. They were convinced that when the West attacked, it would do so under the guise of an exercise.
The Soviets had cars running around the whole of Belgium, the whole of Western Europe, with listening devices on while we were there. That is why it was so important that you never used an open phone line, you never did anything that would compromise the information you've got.
By now, signals from the imaginary front were coming in from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. On occasion, the whole exercise would go quiet for an hour, then mysteriously start again. It was a large puzzle that the Soviets could not quite decipher.
The Soviets, like all intelligence organizations, would be able to read much of the signals traffic that passed down. Let's say you have a divisional headquarters there, squawking away sending. And remember, when you transmit, anyone can hear it. The Soviets would pick that up. That's the divisional headquarters. And it's sending to a headquarters down here that's also sending perhaps to one or two more. That must be divisions. That must be corps headquarters. And you can build up a chain, a network, a web. It's called traffic analysis. And you don't have to read a signal to actually work out the order of battle.
To make sure that the listening Soviets did not get the wrong impression, each NATO signal had exercise, exercise, exercise written all over it.
Does that mean to the suspicious Soviet mind, well, of course they'd say that anyway. It's all part of the big deception. It's all part of NATO's maskirovka. But it doesn't matter what we were doing if the Soviets believed it was a mask for something much worse.
These large-scale military exercises were just fraught with the possibility that under the cover of such an exercise, an unexpected nuclear missile strike could be launched. This was the danger that presented itself.
To give themselves due warning, the Soviets had invested heavily in their satellite technology. These monitored the status of every Western nuclear base, relaying the information directly to military intelligence, the KGB, and even Andropov himself. But this system was not foolproof. 3 weeks after the Korean airliner was shot down, a far less public event occurred that had potentially catastrophic consequences. On the night of 26th of September 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov assumed command of an early warning bunker south of Moscow. He was taking another man's shift.
Any other person could have been the replacement for that night, but the choice fell to me, I suppose. And that was nothing extraordinary, because, after all, it was only ordinary work.
Petrov's ordinary work was to monitor a satellite taking photographs of the American continent. Its computer could detect the launch of American nuclear missiles from their underground silos in the Midwest.
Well, it was truly a shocking sight. The siren began to scream and the word launch flashed up. In big red letters on a white background, it was written launch. The whole thing was incredible.
Without any indication of a malfunction, Petrov expected the satellite photographs to confirm the missile had been launched. But as the sun was now setting across America, the nuclear missile bases were hidden in the evening shadows.
There were points of light sparkling all over the place. To try and pick out an actual rocket launch from among them was virtually impossible.
Unable to see any sign of a missile flash, Petrov trusted his instinct. He ignored the computer and disabled the system. No sooner had he done so than the computer registered a second launch. Now Petrov was forced to inform his boss that he was overriding the satellite for a second time.
And literally, as I took the receiver away from my ear, he hadn't hung up either. I said, "There goes another one."
After the third launch, the computer warning changed to missile attack. This terrifying new information was relayed directly to Andropov himself. The leadership now sought urgent confirmation that the satellite was correct. Only Petrov stood in the way of a massive nuclear retaliation.
The moment the third warning went off, I started feeling like I was sitting in a hot frying pan. I broke out into a sweat. I couldn't feel my feet.
Petrov knew that these American missiles would take 12 minutes to reach Soviet airspace. During that time, the computer registered 2 more launches. Now 5 missiles appeared to be in the air.
I'm the sort of person that when I make a decision, I never change it. Our military training told us that when a missile war with the US began, it would not start with just a few missiles. It would be a massive launch.
Incredibly, Petrov's instinct proved correct. The 5 nuclear missiles were nothing more than high-altitude clouds. These reflected sunlight directly into the satellite's infrared sensors. 20 minutes later, they were gone. But Petrov's ordeal was not over yet. After explaining why he had overridden the computer, he was later discharged from the army.
The bird sitting higher up craps on the bird sitting lower down. And that's how he acted with me. He really offended me.
Petrov's extraordinary actions that night were kept a state secret until the fall of the Soviet Union. The West never understood how fallible the Soviet early warning system had become. It made the leadership feel truly vulnerable. No wonder then that exercise Able Archer, which was rehearsing the steps towards nuclear Armageddon, was having the effect it was.
One of the things that kept the Cold War scary was the lack of understanding on each side of the mentality of the other.
In the autumn of 1983, there was only one man who could tell the West what the Soviet Union was really thinking. He was a double agent turned by British intelligence. Now he was the only reliable source on the paranoia at the top of the Soviet hierarchy. His name was Oleg Gordievsky. In 1983, the tensions between the two superpowers were at their highest for a generation. So it may seem strange, incredible even, that there was only one man who could tell the West what the Soviets were really thinking.
We had some highly restricted but extremely good intelligence on the general thinking of the Russian leadership, which came from our source in the KGB, subsequently revealed to be Mr. Gordievsky.
I met my British contacts once in 4 weeks. It was in Bayswater. A small flat was rented by the service at lunchtime. It was the officer, who was John Scarlett, and the secretary was there to photograph documents if I would come with some documents in my pocket, which I sometimes did.
John Scarlett would immediately pass this information to his superiors. It was so important that it was then sent to the CIA in Washington. At every step, the intelligence was carefully disguised to protect Gordievsky as the actual source. It impressed the US leadership.
When we did provide the president with the information that Gordievsky had given us, his natural response is, do we have anything like Gordievsky? And the answer that we had to give him was no. We had had some very good Soviet sources, but our sources in the Soviet Union tended to be those who provided us with information about their military. What Gordievsky was giving us was information about the thinking of the leadership.
We believed what he told us, we believed he was an honest man reporting things as he saw them and so on. But one always has to weigh this against what I call the wider picture. If ever you believe only intelligence, then you're lost.
The month of October 1983 was one of the tensest of the entire Cold War. With the imminent arrival of the American cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe, CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, held its biggest rally ever. 200,000 people marched in London, another 600,000 in West Germany.
They poured into Bonn this morning in their tens of thousands. 4,000 coaches alone had been laid on to bring them in. Nearly 500,000 people gathered to form a human chain across the Rhine. Former Chancellor Willy Brandt told them later he was firmly against Pershing in this country which already has more missiles than any other in Europe.
Pershing IIs could reach Moscow in 8 minutes. Though their locations were supposed to be top secret, they were well known to the Soviets, courtesy of East German intelligence.
The situation between East and West was very explosive in 1983. There was an actual risk of the Cold War turning into a hot war. We had around 500 very important sources in West Germany at that time, and we knew the missile locations exactly.
Finding out this information was of paramount importance to Moscow, but an even greater coup would be to discover the intentions of NATO itself. If Exercise Able Archer was a mask for a sudden nuclear strike, then there was only one man who could confirm it. He was a German spy at the very heart of NATO, known only as Topaz.
He had chosen the codename Topaz himself. The topaz is a precious stone, and this is how I would describe his activity. He was the jewel in our crown.
NATO from the beginning was my enemy, and I went in to destroy it. I mean, that was, if I could, I would have, and that was my purpose.
For 5 years, Rainer Rupp patiently worked his way up the NATO hierarchy, gaining access to more and more secret information.
I did it with the door open, and I was taking the pictures, and if the bang came...
Oh, sorry. I keep leaving things away.
Get those off by 0300, please.
And went on making notes.
Good night. Good night.
After a while it gets routine, and your heart doesn't even go.
Agent Topaz's intelligence was unique, and the Soviets were hungry for more. He responded by gaining access to the most secret document in NATO. It was called MC-161.
It was cosmic top secret, which was the highest level of classification. You had to read it in the registry. You couldn't take it to your office. It was for eyes only.
Did you photograph it?
Yeah, I photographed it in its entirety, which was quite a lot of work. And I'm not going to tell you how.
The MC-161 was guarded so closely because it contained the crown jewels of NATO's intelligence. It was not a battle plan, but a detailed account of everything the Soviets knew about NATO.
If you know what your enemy knows about you, you know, for instance, that he ignores the strengths is there, and that he ignores your weakness somewhere else, I mean, it's a tremendous advantage.
Throughout 1983, Rainer Rupp kept the Soviets informed about NATO's intentions using a prearranged system.
I always said that there was not the kind of big plan to attack the Soviet Union at 12 o'clock tomorrow type of thing, because the European governments just wouldn't have participated, especially not the German government, because they would have been, if not completely destroyed, but to a large degree also destroyed. But all this talk of the Reagan administration, yes, I do think it could have provoked a nuclear war.
In Moscow, the KGB received these reports, and they shared Agent Topaz's opinion about Reagan. But unlike him, they were convinced that NATO was planning an attack.
Etwa Mitte 1982 in Moscow.
In the middle of 1982, I had a private discussion with General Khrushchev. Khrushchev was very concerned by an imminent nuclear strike of NATO against the Soviet Union. He even talked about the start of a Third World War. Obviously, my question was, where did you get this information from? He remained vague. In intelligence, you never reveal your true sources.
The circle of intelligence remained unbroken. Eager to please their masters in Moscow, agents around the world continued to file their RIAN reports. Whether they were true or not no longer mattered. They only fueled the paranoia at the heart of the Soviet machine.
The RIAN program was absolutely vital because it would provide the immediate signal to the party leadership that something is about to happen.
So the government, the Politburo and all the bosses would get in their lifts very deep down under the Central Committee and the KGB buildings, catch a special train, and then go about 30-40 kilometers to a special underground town where they would sit out the consequences of a nuclear attack on Moscow.
President Reagan also had Armageddon on his mind. On the 10th of October, he held a private screening of The Day After, a highly controversial TV movie, which for the first time on American television showed the full horror of a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union.
The president saw it at Camp David and was quite moved by it. It evoked in him a renewed fear of Armageddon, of the significance of nuclear weapons as a prelude stage of history leading inevitably toward catastrophe.
Reagan committed these private fears to his diary.
It's very effective and left me greatly depressed. So far, they haven't sold any of the 25 ads scheduled, and I can see why.
Shortly after viewing The Day After, Reagan was forced to confront Armageddon yet again. He received his first briefing on the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the SIOP, which described what would happen in the event of a nuclear war.
But for the president, this being the first time he was actually exposed to these scenarios, it was a very sobering moment.
In his diary, he wrote,
"One of the first statistics I saw was the most sobering, startling I've ever heard. I'll never forget it. The Pentagon said at least 150 million American lives would be lost in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, even if we won. And there are still some people at the Pentagon who claim that nuclear war is winnable. I thought they were crazy."
Reagan's response was to order American scientists to speed up research into his beloved Star Wars project. In the eyes of the KGB, this acceleration was yet another sign that the Americans were preparing for war. By the end of Saturday, the 5th of November, in the war game of Able Archer, the script predicted the imminent use of chemical weapons by the Soviet Union. Out in the real world, we now know that that same evening, Oleg Gordievsky received another unnerving telegram from Moscow. It contained the timetable for a Western first strike.
It can be assumed that once the preliminary decision for Rian is taken, the first strike will follow soon after, possibly 7 to 10 days.
The telegram added that the countdown had already begun. On Monday, the 7th of November, the war game of Able Archer entered a new phase. The next page of the scenario indicated that the Soviets had launched chemical weapons. This would force the players towards a nuclear response.
The idea that anyone could deviate from the exercise planning staff script is frankly bizarre, because one of the problems with exercises is if someone starts to do a bit of free play, as it's called, and actually do rather well, and maybe start to win the war, it spoils the exercise for everybody else. So everyone sticks to the script.
As the Soviet military struggled to follow the imaginary war that NATO was now fighting, new and potentially alarming news was being passed on to the KGB. Around the world, American military installations were moving on to a heightened state of alert. But this had nothing to do with imminent nuclear war. On the 23rd of October, 2 weeks before Able Archer had begun, a massive suicide bomb exploded on the US Marines base in Beirut. 241 soldiers were killed.
One of the consequences of the attack on the Marines in Beirut was a tightening of security at all U.S. facilities. And they started parking trucks next to the entrance at the White House as a barrier. We'd never been hit by a truck bomb before. Soviets would have seen the tightening of security at U.S. installations all over the world was tied to what had happened in Beirut, not to anything that was going to happen in Europe.
And as if everything that had gone before was not enough, yet another Rian indicator occurred the day after the Beirut bomb. Without any prior warning, American Marines landed on the tiny Commonwealth island of Grenada. They were there to overthrow the fledgling communist regime.
Mrs. Thatcher's reaction to the American invasion of Grenada was one of deep indignation. First of all, that she had neither been informed or consulted in advance, and secondly, that the Americans had marched into one part of the Queen's dominions without so much as a by your leave.
The invasion provoked a storm of ciphered communication between Mrs. Thatcher and the White House.
There were some extremely tetchy, not to say irritable, telephone conversations at the time. And I think, from hindsight, President Reagan probably deeply regretted that he hadn't got round to mentioning it.
To the KGB in Moscow, this barrage of communication was precisely what they expected to happen prior to a nuclear strike.
One of the things to understand about the KGB that made it different from American intelligence, and for that matter from British intelligence, is that it really had no analytical capability. You had all these spies out there reporting information, and there was no one analyzing it for accuracy or whether it was real or not.
If President Reagan did intend to attack the Soviet Union, then he was going to elaborate lengths to conceal it. Early on the morning of Tuesday, the 8th of November, he set off on a trip to South Korea and Japan. He had with him the nuclear football, an 18-kilogram briefcase. This contained the launch codes to be used by the president in the event of a nuclear war. On this same morning, the war game of Able Archer entered its final phase. Having failed to contain the Soviet chemical attack, the script now demanded the use of nuclear weapons. The nuclear planners began to identify their targets.
They were exercising people like myself in making the right response, and of course we did use our actual plans.
That afternoon, the Supreme Allied Commander approved 25 targets in Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia. The nuclear request was immediately transmitted to London and Washington. This top-secret frequency was picked up by the listening Soviets.
Now, the question of whether the Soviets could read the nuclear release procedures is a very interesting question. We have to assume they couldn't, but it appears they reacted like a scolded cat.
Determined not to be taken by surprise, the Soviet military began to take defensive measures against Able Archer. In Eastern Europe, tanks and troops deployed to their wartime positions. Nuclear bombers were put on standby.
All the air crews were stationed right by their planes. The command came, all pilots into your cockpits, start your engines. And then we waited, either to take off or to remain in the cockpit. It was very tense, waiting for that command. Your nerves are jangling.
Up in the Baltic, the vast northern fleet prepared for imminent attack.
Our big ships, the cruisers, sailed right in close towards the cliffs, of which there were many. Because to distinguish a grey ship against a background of cliffs is extremely difficult.
Up on the edge of the Arctic, massive nuclear submarines dashed for the cover of the ice. In the event of a nuclear exchange, their intercontinental ballistic missiles would prove decisive.
It is almost impossible to find a submarine under the ice. We waited by our hole, making sure we could receive every signal, so that the time needed to make a counterstrike is as short as possible.
In the eyes of the Soviet leadership, these serious defensive measures were absolutely necessary.
On the military side, there might have been quite several dozen senior officers who believed in it. That's why they had that weight behind them to persuade the Central Committee and then the KGB, Andropov, that it was a realistic idea.
Nevertheless, they knew that the release of any nuclear weapon by the United States ultimately required the permission of the president himself. In the original script of Able Archer, Reagan was due to participate, but at the last moment, Bud McFarlane had quietly changed the plan.
Any time we conduct an operation like that, it's watched carefully by the Soviet Union. And if you go to the point of having the principals, the decision makers actually involved, the question's raised, is this an exercise or are we not facing a possible attack? The president came around to my view that however misguided Soviet perceptions were, we shouldn't even add any possibility of their raising the stakes, and he withdrew.
With Ronald Reagan no longer involved, NATO leaders also declined to participate. Their roles were taken by military aides. On the evening of the 8th of November, they sent back the signal approving the use of nuclear weapons. To the watching Soviets, it appeared that the final piece of the jigsaw was now in place.
It was a very serious problem. Suddenly it seemed as if the Americans were just about to launch a surprise nuclear attack.
Vladimir Khrushchev had already warned that a nuclear attack might happen in the next 7 to 10 days. Now it seemed that his prediction was correct. The world was on the verge of Armageddon. That evening, Oleg Gordievsky received an extraordinary cable from Moscow.
When it was a flash telegram, it was a super urgent telegram, which is now a critical situation. The Americans exercise may be preparation to a sudden nuclear attack, watch the signs, and report immediately to us about anything unusual. How can we take such a task seriously?
The KGB sent out flash telegrams to every station in the world. They also alerted Topaz, their star agent at the heart of NATO.
The courier at first brought me the message. High alert, the Russians are really scared, they want to know everything, NATO is preparing for war. I was really upset. I was thinking, where is this leading?
Rainer Rupp was expected to give the KGB warning of the imminent attack using a special device concealed inside a calculator.
I would write my message down, I would code it, and this little machine would then condense all this into a very short sound, like a... With that, I would go to a normal telephone.
Did you send a message during Able Archer?
Yeah.
What did it say?
There was no indication that NATO was preparing for war at that time. I'm talking about NATO, I'm not talking about the United States, because they're always two quite different things.
Over the horn.
CIA spy satellites watched these military preparations without concern. They photographed nuclear bombers alongside runways in East Germany, troops and tanks at their battle positions in Eastern Europe, Soviet submarines hiding in the Arctic ice. But they were blind to the paranoia gripping the Soviet leadership. Nor could they pick up that the most powerful weapons on Earth were poised to unleash Armageddon. In the imaginary war game of Able Archer, the script had reached the final page. Having obtained permission to use nuclear weapons, the nuclear commandos now had to wait the whole night before they were allowed to press the button.
By the time the exercise came to its fruition, it would have gone nuclear, and there's a kind of wave of rising interest and enthusiasm. When it had gone critical, we were asking for nuclear release, bang, and then we can all go home.
They were not aware that this very night was a special date in the Soviet calendar.
In November 1983, I was a captain serving in the Strategic Missile Force. Our commanders always told us that war would begin on the eve of some holiday, when people were out celebrating, when people were relaxed.
The 7th of November 1983 was Revolution Day, which began several days of celebration. In the minds of the Soviet leaders, this was their moment of greatest weakness.
We expected that at precisely that moment, the Americans might unleash the Third World War. When we reached the command bunker that night, we received a special order. We were told to immediately go to raised combat alert. It was so serious, there was a third man there with us to maintain uninterrupted communications.
Unseen by watching American satellites, over 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles prepared for a massive retaliatory strike.
The strategic nuclear forces secretly, I emphasize that it was secretly, went up to increased combat readiness. This fact was not communicated to the rest of the armed forces.
Under my command were 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles. On each missile there were 10 warheads. Each of these was aimed at a particular city, like Washington, New York, Philadelphia, and so on. The targeting was very, very precise. The devastation would have been total.
Each missile had the force of 150 Hiroshimas. And these were not the only nuclear forces preparing for war. Unseen by the West, 75 SS-20s had also dispersed into the field.
Back then, spy satellites were not powerful enough to pinpoint their locations once they were in place, and SS-20s had all sorts of camouflaging devices, so they could not be spotted by visual or radio reconnaissance.
Controlling this vast secret escalation was the chief of the army himself, Marshal Argarkov. That night, he descended into the central command bunker. Back in the nuclear vault of Able Archer, the mood could not have been more different.
I can see no reason why it would have alarmed the Soviets at all. They held their own exercises. They went through exactly the same sort of procedures as we did. And certainly, I mean, the Able Archer, I mean, it was well known. It was just a paper exercise, a command post exercise.
This was not how the Soviets saw it. Cocooned inside his hospital suite, Yuri Andropov knew that he would be amongst the first of NATO's targets.
What we in the nuclear forces feared the most was that too much time might be lost in the decision-making process. If the flying time of the Pershing was only 8 minutes, then the window in which they had to make their decision was drastically reduced.
In Soviet Russia, 3 men had the authority to launch nuclear weapons. Besides Andropov, both the defense minister and the head of the army held chegets, a Soviet equivalent to the nuclear football. These contained the launch codes to the nuclear weapons.
In the background of 1983 and the level of tensions, they really were, I think, concerned that maybe the United States was getting ready to strike.
There is one important consideration that we often forget. Remember, the Americans did use nuclear weapons once. It wasn't just a test. They destroyed 2 Japanese cities.
Throughout the night of the 8th of November, the entire Soviet war machine waited for the nuclear signal. Every event of 1983 had led up to this moment. Now, surely, the Americans would launch a nuclear attack. They had the desire, the motives, and in Able Archer, they had the perfect cover. All the Soviets could do now was wait for them to press the button, and then retaliate.
Anything could have happened. We were ready for the Third World War, if the Americans enlisted.
At dawn the following day, the Soviets intercepted the NATO signal that nuclear missiles had been launched.
We were waiting for the one most important order. That is the order to open the safe with launch codes. When you open that document, your hands are shaking. It is the most terrifying thing. But we knew that if we had received the order, American missiles were already flying towards us.
The targets had been chosen. The coded messages had been sent. But the missiles remained nothing more than pieces of paper in a war game. On the last morning, 350 imaginary nuclear weapons were launched at targets in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And then, quite suddenly, the exercise ended. After all, it was the 11th of November, Armistice Day.
Can you imagine people like Andropov starting a war? How would they would spend their last month of their life in the condition of a nuclear war? Who wants to have such a disastrous, uncomfortable end of their life? It was absolutely human feeling.
I know these people personally. They would never resort to arms first. That's part of the Russian culture, which is often not properly understood in the West. We had too many wars. We lost millions of people. For us, the war is the last resort.
And Yuri Andropov was well aware that his beloved Operation Rian was still not complete.
It was just about half. So this so-called proof, it was not a proof. The proof was saying, no, There's no sign of the preparation to a nuclear attack.
No one was more relieved that it was over than the men with their fingers on the button, the Soviet missile crews.
I returned home after serving my combat duty. My wife was so pleased to see me. They were all so happy. And the very next day we had another party to celebrate the Revolution Day holiday. In fact, even today we still celebrate it.
It was only after Able Archer had finished that the West discovered the extraordinary Soviet reaction.
I spoke to John Scarlett about everything which I experienced. I knew it was a dramatic moment. I knew Moscow was nervous. That the KGB regarded it as a folly, the KGB station in London regarded it as a folly. It didn't matter for him. It was important for him what was happening in Moscow.
This intelligence was also taken seriously by the Americans, and it was greeted with universal surprise.
The president didn't actually read each word, but he did receive from the CIA the key core issues that were exposed in Gordievsky's reports, and was very moved by them.
My first reaction to the Gordievsky reporting was not only that we might have had a major intelligence failure, but further that the most terrifying thing about Able Archer was that we may have been at the brink of nuclear war and not even known it.
Three days after the end of the exercise, the first cruise missiles arrived at Greenham Common Air Base in England. Hundreds of Pershing IIs met a similar reception in West Germany, Italy and Greece. To the protesters, nuclear war was coming closer. They had no idea just how close it had really been. For Yuri Andropov, the war scare of Able Archer was the last crisis of his leadership. 2 months later, he was dead. A year later, Oleg Gordievsky was recalled to Moscow. Realizing he was under surveillance, he contacted MI6.
Everybody during the Cold War who was in touch with the Foreign Intelligence Service, all were caught and all were shot. All.
Recognizing the danger he was in, British agents smuggled Gordievsky out over the Finnish border in July 1985.
I'm the only one of those 10 heroic officers.
You're a lucky man.
Yes, incredibly lucky. It's like a second life.
Rainer Rupp was not so fortunate. In 1993, the CIA finally caught up with Topaz.
I hurt NATO very much. In particular, I hurt the United States. And I'm still pleased that I did it.
Rupp was awarded a maximum 12-year sentence, of which he served 7.
Do you think the Americans would like you to still be in jail?
Oh, quite clearly. And they would prefer not only me to be in jail, but to throw the key away.
During 1983, an accidental nuclear war between East and West almost happened. Neither side wanted it, but they did not communicate. Only the spies on opposite sides kept the peace. Ironically, the Soviet panic in November 1983 caused Ronald Reagan to change his mind. He was determined to start talking to the new Soviet leader himself. After a series of meetings, he visited Moscow in the last year of his presidency.
Do you still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President?
No.
It marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
8:05 next Saturday for the new series of ER, and you can catch up with the cliffhanger from the previous series just before it at 7:05. Next tonight, a roller coaster romance with Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant in our Saturday movie, Notting Hill.